Hi everyone. Today we'll look at lesson 7, access control management. We will look at the subject of access control and access control management. And we will also want to understand the concept of identification, authentication, authorization, and accountability, which are the four basic concepts pertaining to access control. And then we'll look at user access management, which is a key piece. And then we'll also introduce the concept and talk a little bit about privilege management, what that is, and how usually business implement them. So this is our agenda today. We'll look at an introduction of access control and access control management. And then we'll look into the access control function, the various access control functions, and then how to implement them. And then we look at user access management. This is a key piece for most of the IT administrators, is to managing user access. But it's not just an IT activity, it's also a business activities, because IT only implement what the business allow or authorize, right? So we'll talk about the relationship between the business and the technology in terms of user access management. And then, of course, we want to talk about user password management as a key piece. And then last but not least is the user responsibility. Often, I think in the first lesson, we talked about user being the weakest link of the security triangle. So it is important to understand how we can manage that better, improve that. And that's why we have to emphasize the user responsibility. Okay. This is the big picture. As you can see, identity and access management is actually kind of midpoint now. This is module 7, so that's kind of a midpoint, just so you know. Okay, so let's get started. Again, I'm going to bring back the CIA triad: confidentiality, availability, and integrity. This is what we refer to as the principles of security. Confidentiality, the C, means to prevent any unauthorized disclosure of data. Okay, this is, I think, the most intuitive part of the triad, CIA triad, and everybody understands this. We're trying to keep things confidential or keep things secret by not letting unnecessary people, unauthorized people know about the information. So everybody understands these parts, the confidentiality part, or the secret of the protection of secrets, that part. On the other hand, the integrity, which is preventing the modification of data from unauthorized people. I mean, if the information we are protecting are actually not accurate, then that's a big hole, right? You can protect all you want, but if the integrity of the informations are had a problem, then that's also a big hole in that security triangle. And then the A is the availability. Often we can design all these processes, technologies, and that people has to jump through hoops to get to the data and make them confidential, protected, and also, not easy to modify and whatnot. But we forget about the fact that if informations are not readily available when needed by the authorized users, then it defeats the purpose, right? It's like a vault, right? Like a vault in a bank. If there is difficulty accessing the vault, so information or assets that are required to be accessed are not available when they are needed, then again it defeats the purpose, and that's a big part of the principle of security as well. I have talked about that in the first lesson, so this is not new to you. Okay, so what is access control then? Access control is a security technique that determine or regulate who and what can be viewed or use resources in a computing environment. So who can access and what this person can access is what we talk about controlling the access. Okay, controlling who and controlling what. It is also a fundamental concept in security that minimizes risk to the business enterprise or business organization. minimizing the risk in unauthorized disclosure, unauthorized modification or removal, which affect integrity, and making the required information, minimize the risk of making the required information unavailable when it is required. Okay, so that's access control, and that's how it actually ties in with the triad, okay, the CIA triad. What about access control management? Well, as the name indicates, it's about managing it. So access controls are security features that control how users and systems communicate and interact with other systems and resources. Okay, so access control protects the system and resources from unauthorized access, obviously, and access control also determines the level of authorization after a successful completion of an authentication process. So someone get authenticated before they can have access. So access control management include, the big part of it is not just restricted, but also granted or authorizing, authenticating the process. Access control is also very important because this is the first line of defense, right? So you only allow people that are authorized, they're supposed to be, that access your information, modify your information, and access the information in the most available fashion, right? And if that's not done well, then you are allowing unauthorized people to come in and do whatever sort of things that they can. So that's why that's referred to as the first line of defense. Now, of course, once you get in, you have access to the system. It does not mean you have access to everything. So that's the different layer, okay? So there is typically two types of access control, physical and logical. So physical is things that are more tangible, things that you can see, you can feel, you can touch. So these are, office buildings. You need a card key to get into a building, campuses. Maybe you have security to get by and look at your student card. And then within the building, there are different rooms that are more restricted than the general area. So you need the card access again, and some can and some cannot. We talk about this layer access. Obviously, data center, server room, that sort of things. And then also physical IT assets. We had a different lesson 9, that will devote to talk about physical securities. But basically, in the type of access control, physical access control, it's about these things that we can see. But a lot of the access are actually something we can't see. It's like logical access. So we're talking about providing a user name and a password, and then accessing data in the back end of the server. We don't need to go to the building. We don't need to open up the room. We don't need to have access to the data center. We just have logical access through our computer, our laptop, via the internet, over the network at the enterprise, and then we get to our information. So that's considered as logical access. Include connection to the network, system files, databases, etc., etc. Access control function. So what are the functions that we're talking about in access control? So basically there are 4 access control functions: identification, authentication, authorization, and accountability. So we'll look at them individually. So this is what it looks like if you're going to put all these into kind of like a flow, right? So the user has to provide his or her identification, and with that piece of identification, usually it's a username or user ID, account number or whatnot, then the user will be authenticated by the system. Okay, so you say you're a user, Quan M123, then you need to be authenticated by usually providing maybe a password, passcode, or your biometric, etc., etc. So there's a step that called authentication to authenticate your identification. You are who you say you are. Okay. Once you have been identified and authenticated, then you will check. You'll be checked what you are authorized to do after you get access to that particular computing resources. It could be a network, it could be a computer system. And then by accessing the resources like a printer or like a database and whatnot, then during the access of the resources that you are authorized to do after you've been authenticated, whatever you do need to be accountable. So there are records of when you sign on, when you get access, what you have used and what you use it for, read, write, or modification, and for how long, and so on. The accountability becomes key when there is a problem or when you do review of access. We talk about integrity, right? So sometimes there might be some mistake that someone should not have access to the information and it was mistakenly given, or often than not someone was given it first, but later on their job changes, so they should not have any further access to those resources. It could be a database or a file, but then nobody remembered to remove it. So if something bad happened, the accountability is looking back, knowing who did what at what time as an evidence. So it's a big part of that as well. So let's look at them individually. So identification is before a user is able to access something, he has to provide his identification, okay? And then from that identification, the system will have to authenticate that identification, okay? So identification are not just for people. It could be for program, process that need to access certain resources. So it's not just restricted to users or people, but often we think of that as a user ID and a password, okay? As I mentioned, identification is like a username or account number. Authentication is the step to prove the user is who she say she is. So I say, I am Michael Kwan 123, that's my user ID, and then the system will say, okay, prove it. Provide a passcode, password, or whatever secret information that are associated with that identification that you've been provided previously, okay? To us, most of us, this is a username and a password which we use, so often, so many times, and so on. So the system will receive what you enter as a piece of evidence to authenticate you are actually what you claim you are from an identification point of view. So it could be password, passphrase, key, cryptographic key, a PIN number, or any other attributes, or even a token. You've probably seen one of those, token that generate a number, every 60 seconds or something like that. And so with these two pieces of credentials, the user ID and the password, they are being compared to information that has been previously created and stored in the system, and then try to match. Okay, so you say you're Kwan 123, Michael Kwan 123, and you provided the password of 45678, and then they're going to match it. Oh, yeah, okay, you got it. That's actually true. Then authentication is passed, access to that resources is granted. Okay? Well, I will talk a little bit more about that, but basically once the credential has been authenticated, then you're considered as authenticated. So as to what you can have, that's the next step. But before we go there, we want to talk about authentication factors. There are basically commonly 3 factors we talk about. Authentication factor can be something that we know, okay? Meaning that I have to remember a password that's something I know, or something the person has, okay? So it could be a key fob, something that I carry, and then it generates a number, something I have. I don't have to know that because it changes, right? And then something a person is. Now, so this one is like, okay, who am I? So what do I look like? Face recognition, or maybe biometric on fingerprint, or voice print, or iris scan like the eye and so on. So that's something who I am, okay? Like physical features characteristics. Authentication by knowledge is something that we know. I kind of already covered that. Something a person knows. So this would be example would be password, PIN number, mother's maiden name, and combination of a log and so on. There is a concept called, or this is the least expensive method to implement. Okay, it's just something that you issue, you create, and then the user has to remember. So there's nothing to manage. Okay, well, you still have to manage about password reset if someone forgot the password. But compared with the other two subsequent methods, then you know that this is the cheapest, the least expensive one. The downside of that is that the information can be, the intruder can also acquire the same information and gain unauthorized access. So if it's just a password, so someone can guess your password, or no one can stop the user by sharing the password with somebody else, which is although a no-no, but it's possible. Okay. Authenticate by ownership. Okay. So this is something that the person has. So we talk about like a key fob, a swipe card, access card, or a badge. Now the badge itself doesn't mean anything. The badge itself usually have maybe a what do you call it, magnetic stripe, something like that, and so on. So this is a fairly common mechanism to allow access to a facility, okay, and also for an added restriction on sensitive area or systems. It could be a second layer, or this could be the default instead of using the password. Okay, so the downside of that is the item can be lost or stolen. If you use a key or card, that's a physical thing, right? Physical things can be lost, okay, which can result in somebody picking it up or somebody purposely steal it from you so that they can have access as you, because you're talking about an item now, right? And then the item can be stolen and disappear. The last one is the authentication by characteristics. So I talk about that as something specific to a person, like a physical attribute of a person, fingerprint, iris, retina, and palm, and so on, face as well. So that's better, because nobody can have that now. You saw a lot of movies about people cutting off a finger or your palm in order to gain access. But I think the device are more sophisticated than that. Like, if the finger has been chopped off, so there is no perspiration, so the sensor can actually sense whether this is a dead finger or kind of a reproduction of the fingerprint. So there are other attributes that the fingerprinter reader would be able to discern whether this is actually from a live person. Okay, I'm not going to get into that. But again, this is not something that people can easily steal or remember. Okay? So what is considered a strong authentication? Okay? So we'll talk about three factors, right? What you remember, your knowledge, what you have, like ownership, and what you are. Okay? So the stronger authentication actually refer to maybe choosing 2 out of the three methods. Don't just use one. Okay, use 2 out of the 3. So either you have a password and plus a biometric, or you use a password and a key fob. Okay. Yeah, biometric system. It actually is a statement here. I want to explain that. Saying using biometric system by itself does not provide strong authentication. Now, often when you do biometric system, I actually had a personal experience in implementing a biometric system way back in almost 10 years ago. Of course, the technology become better, but the challenge is something called false positive and false negative. Okay, so it is a fact. It is a factor that you can fine-tune. False positive meaning the fingerprint is close enough that they allow a certain percentage of error. if the percentage of error is large, meaning that there could be false positive, meaning that people that are not that person, but because you only check a certain percentage of the fingerprint pattern, then somebody else may have a fingerprint that are close enough, not 100%. We're not talking about the criminal fingerprint system, not the sophisticated, which you can stand at the court of law of how many percentage that people, it's certain that this is that person. We're not talking about that. The biometric scanning system for system access allow a factor for you to fine tune. Otherwise, it would be very frustrated because the fingerprint can also be, as a human, you can have a cut, at the kitchen, and then it damage your fingerprint, then it won't work for that day. Then you're stuck, right? And also perspiration, a lot of perspiration or dirtiness. Okay, as you can imagine, I mean, your hand touch dirt and so on, and then it will fill out the trough of the fingerprint pattern. Then it won't recognize. Also, on the other end is false negative. If you tune it very tight, that means even the right person going in, because of those factors I just talked about, then you get rejected. So that's called a false negative. So biometric is not foolproof. I tell you this story. You know that Apple iPhone using facial recognition, right? I mean, iPhone 10 at least. And you know what? In our family, my daughter is an adult daughter. She's like 20 something now. So she can actually use mom's phone at her face and get opened up. So their facial features are similar enough that she can open mom's phone. And that was actually very interesting. And so biometric is not foolproof, and biometric itself can, if you just rely on biometric system, that could be dangerous, okay? So as it suggests, you always couple with what the person knows or has. That's what we call two-factor authentication, not just one factor, but two. Once you have been identified, once you've been authenticated, that's it comes to the third point, third function, which is authorization. Okay? Once the provided credentials are properly identified or authenticated, the system will look for the access control matrix in terms of, okay, so this person is Michael Kwan. He come in at this time, at this system, what can he do? So the matrix tells that, okay, he has read, write, or change access in this and not that, and so on. So the matrix will determine what Michael Kwan, although after the credential has been authenticated, it will determine what he or she can do. Okay? And accountability, I kind of mentioned about that. The accountability is the auditing capability, making sure users are accountable for their actions, even though they have been identified, even though they have been authenticated, even though they have been authorized. Okay? I mean, even though you're authorized, I mean, the system still wanted to know what you have done in case there are things that are, that are not supposed to get to happen, but then it happened, during your access. Then at least there's an accountability that people will be able to find out. So just the mere fact that the system has an audit trail, has a reporting capability, that whatever you've done, it's accountable. Just those information will have some deterring effect on people trying to cheat the system or trying to do something that are illegal or against the policy. Okay. So accountability mechanism, if properly configured, can be used to track bad deeds back to the individual, detect intrusion, and reconstruct events like using evidence, right? And then system condition provide legal resources for future litigation, perhaps. Okay. Of course, you need human resources to try to correlate the audit log and the persons and so on. I mean, logging and monitoring is a key security feature, but it's not something that is trivial. So you can collect all the accountability information you want, and that's not difficult to do. But to correlate and make use of and make sense of the audit trail data, that's the challenge. Okay, often overnight you come back as a system administrator. Do you look at the log? I mean, there are so much information to look for. So there need to be some sort of training, some sort of priority, some sort of mechanism in order to understand the audit trail and pinpoint whether that was problem occur. That's what's missing, and this is where one area, AI, artificial intelligence, can be very, very useful. We can train the machine to look for things that human eyes can look at, but we get fatigued, right? So if you're looking at 500,000 access record every day, I mean, it's just not possible. For a human eye, you get fatigued, you get familiarized, and then you just didn't pick it up. But AI is different. So you're training a computer to look for a pattern. That's the way to go, in my opinion. Okay, so identity and access management. This is a closely related subject with access control management. We put in identity. Remember, we talk about identification. So this is an area whereby it includes technology products to identify, authenticate, and authorize users through an automation mean. So user can be creating an identity, providing an access, and also authorize and also track their authorization. So it is usually a technology that you can implement. It may also include user account management, access control, password management, single sign-on. Single sign-on meaning that in a typical corporation, you sign on to the network, you sign on only once. Because of the authorization matrix, then the system knows whether you can access this database, that network, that printer, and so on without logging in every time, or even applications. Okay. Typically, these systems provide access control software, user database, and management tools for access control policies, auditing, and enforcement. So IDM, or Identity and Access Management, usually are technology or applications that are built for much larger corporation. If you're talking about 100,000 or more users, then you can't really do all these manually. So you need something to do. So identity and access management are not for small companies. They are for companies that have thousands of users, that it's to a point that it's almost not practical to manage user access and authorizations by human beings. Okay? So IDM, Identity and Access Management products, are by nature complicated, and that's why you need careful planning. And often the company that sell them, like IBM, provide rich set of consulting services that will make it work. But once you implemented them, it will make life so easy for the system admin people. Okay, some of the things that are worth mentioning about implementing IDM, information security professional or the teams must understand the IDM solution as a whole and its technology and its implication. IDM requires management of uniquely identified entities. So the implementation of IDM involved talking to system owners of different system or application owner and data owner so that they all understand if they want to participate, this is what they'll get, okay? And this is the process to get involved, okay? So if you're removing a user, you don't have to worry about whether you remove user from the system that should still have this kind of access. The IDM will take care of that, but the various business will have to report to the team that manage the IDM system. So the enterprise IDM must meet business needs and scale from internally facing system to external facing system. So IDM can also managing third-party users. So in your enterprise, you may have systems that are outward facing for your customer and for your third parties. IDM can also manage that as well. So it is a very sophisticated, comprehensive system, but it will take time and resources to implement it correctly. So you need help. If you're doing this the first time, you need help from the company that actually sell you the IDM. So instead of just the product or the technology, it should be a solution, not just a one piece. Okay. So we want to talk about implementing access control. Okay. Access control is a process that is integrated into an organization's IT. It can involve identity and access management system, not necessarily, but it can. When a user is added to an access management system admin should uses an automated provision system to set up permission based on the access control framework, job responsibility and workflow. So there need to be business process for the direct report manager to authorize based on a role base. So if this person is coming in as a technical support, then this would be the access that this person should have, or technical support for this product, and then just a user for this product and admin for this product. So based on that, the system admin will create access in according to what is required to support the business. There is something that I think I mentioned about in first or second lesson. It's called the least privilege. Okay, least privilege is a concept that we only give just sufficient privilege for the user, not too much. Okay, in a sense that we rather the person come back and ask for more if the provided privilege is not sufficient for him or her to do their job, rather than giving too much and have a risk of inappropriate use of those privileges. So these privileges are talking about maybe access to a part of the system, modifying part of a file, system file, configuration file, and whatnot. Okay. So the least privilege security practice restrict access to only resources that an employee required to perform their immediate job functions. Not to give them too much just in case they need it, not to give them something for them to grow into, no. Only things that they need today, okay? A common security issue is a failure to revoke credential and access to system and data when an individual move into a different job internally or leave the company. This is a very common occurrence. Sure, we do a lot of the vetting at the beginning to get the access correctly, and but subsequently, when the person move away from the job, people don't remember to remove their access. So that's the problem, and that's something that you have to keep in mind when you are implementing access control. So the next thing we want to talk about is the access control policy. As part of implementation, obviously we want to set expectation both for the user, the manager that grants the user access, as well as for people that actually provide control of access. So you're talking about the IT team, the information security team, so they know what to follow and what are allowed and what are not. So that's what the access control policy is about. So this is not an actual policy, but these are requirements, the things that you have to consider when you are setting up an access control policy. Obviously, the access control policy will have to base on the security requirement of the individual business application. So different applications may have different requirements for security, for sure. And I think part of that is to identify what are the information that each business applications are collecting, processing, and store. I mean, that has everything to do with information classification, and if we are taking a risk-based approach, the application that has more sensitive information, obviously the access control will have to be more strict, right? And so you need to be consistent with the access control policy. Need to be consistent with the information classification policy. And also, there is a big part of it, especially if you are protecting personal information. We talk about it in the access control, access classification class, that personal identifiable information and personal health information are are governed by relevant legislations and regulations and law. So access control policy will have to respect that. We'll have to take that into consideration. If there are personal identifiable informations and personal health information that we are talking about that are being managed and collected by the business application, then the access control will have to have restrictions on who can have access and how access should be granted. Okay, and one other thing is that the user access will have to be in line with the role of the job. Okay, so when you're doing that, it's worthwhile defining different role, and there should be a common user role that that will enable people to have the minimum access. So the access control policy should also mention management of access right in a distributed and network environment. So it's not just one location perhaps. It could also be a multi-location, especially if you're dealing with an enterprise that are geographically dispersed. Then you have to manage information in a widely distributed network. So, access control will have to take that into consideration. Also, I think one of the other things that's also very key is the segregation of access control roles. People that are requesting access cannot be the same person that actually receiving the access. So I cannot request access for myself. Someone has to request access for me, or I have to. So if there is a user and they report to a manager, and usually the policy should be that manager or supervisor of those users will have to initiate the request. And obviously the person making or initiating the request cannot authorize them. Someone else has to authorize them, and someone else has to also administrate them. So you can't really have one person that do everything. So that will open up for a risk of someone you will create an account for him or her to commit crime or whatnot, right? And the access control policy should also talk about whether there is a requirement for formal authorization of access requests, whether people has to provide a signature or email, or you actually use access controls technology or process or product application in order to flow through. There's a workflow that someone has to read the request and then click a button to authorize and so on. And access control should also include something very important. It's called review of access control. So from time to time, the access should be a test. So once a person is created into the system, it doesn't really automatically have that access indefinitely. So periodically, maybe a month, maybe every quarter, depending on what's the volume and the frequency of changes for your user access, the person that granted the access, the manager, should have a responsibility to review and attest to those access that he or she granted for people that work for him or her, right? And obviously the access control will have a entire section that talk about removal of access. Okay, under what circumstances access should be removed or put on hold, and if someone is being removed, should the account being permanently removed right away, which usually you shouldn't, because there are files perhaps stored on that user account. If you remove them permanently, those files may be useful for somebody else. So usually access will be removed, but the files and the evidence and the log file, they all should be retained for a period of time. There are some access control rules to consider, such as differentiating between rules that must always enforce and guidelines that are optional or conditional. So there are hard rules that everyone has to follow, but there are also some guidelines that it's good to have that are optional. So you allow certain flexibility. Otherwise, it will be a very complicated system to implement. Okay, you establish rules based on the premises that everything is generally forbidden unless expressed permitted. Okay, so this is a harder rule. So by default, you don't have access. Okay, as compared to the weaker rule, which is everything is generally permitted unless expressly forbidden. So this would be a weaker rule, and that's the problem, because you might not remember to remove people with extra access. And people usually have extra access will not come to you and complain. Whereas if you flip this around, if you give people only minimum, I talk about the least privilege, right? So if you don't give people access, and when they really need that access to do the work, they'll come and request it, and then you have a chance to double check them, to scrutinize them, saying that why do you need access, justify for me, right? So that's a better rule than giving them all access, and if you don't have it, I'll take it back. You'll never take it back because nobody will come and tell you that, oh, I don't really need to look at this file. Whereas the other way around, it's more true. Okay. There is also changes in information label that are initiated automatically by information processing facility that initiate at discretion of user. So we're talking about labeling of information from last week. Okay. Changes in user permission that are initiated automatically by the system, and those initiated by the administrator. So the system can compile a request based on user not able to access certain things, or based on new users that can access certain part, but because their role has changed, then the system can actually request that increase of privilege or access. Okay. And rules which require specific approval before enactment, and there are rules that do not. So normally I would need people to authorize them because that's part of the accountability, right? Yep, so these rules should be supported by formal procedures, so policies and procedures, right? So you have a policy, you need to develop procedures that people can actually follow step by step. And so if you only have a policy statement, but you don't have a procedure, then people won't know what to follow and what not. Okay, so let's take a look at user access management. Okay, user access management is to make sure that users that are authorized and properly, if they have to, they have the need to use it, or to prevent any users that doesn't really have the requirement. So to prevent unauthorized access. So basically user access means to provide authorized access to people that need it, and to prevent unauthorized access that they shouldn't need it. Okay? As I mentioned earlier, the formal procedure should be in place to control allocation of access right to information systems and services and resources. The procedure should cover all stages of life cycle of a user access, from initial registration, deregistration, removal, and so on. All right. Special attention should be given where appropriate to the need to control the allocation of privileged access right, which allow user to override system control. So any highly privileged access should need to be particularly careful. You may need a multiple authorization because these people, once authorized, they had privilege to create high-level access, highly privileged level access, or those access can actually have major impact in a system if they modify them unauthorized, unintentionally, and so on. Okay, so let's talk about user registration. We talked about identification, right? Earlier about access control functions. Of course, we want to use unique user ID to make sure users can be linked to and held responsible for the actions. So we can't have two Michael Kwan 1, 2, 3. Then you won't know which person is accountable for the action. So user ID must be unique all through the enterprise. So you have to think about how a user ID should be formed together. I mean, if you had, over 10,000 employees, then you can't use the 4-digit numbers, something like that, right? So you wanna have a way to. So a lot of company use the last name and the first initial, like so. I would be Kwan M, but what if there is another, not Michael Kwan, but it could be a Mitch Kwan or Mark Kwan or something like that. Then you want to have maybe Kwan M1, Kwan M2, and so on. So you need to think through that, and also grouping them together if you want to. Like if this belongs to IT, this belongs to business, and then within business there are different divisions and so on. And checking that the user has authorization from the system owner for the use of their information system. So we talked about asset classification last week, that each system has its owner, data has data owner, application have application owner. So by granting access, the owner of that resources, so be it system owner, application owner, or data owner, the resource owner should have a say, or at least have a way to indicate whether they're in agreement or not. Now, understand that they may not always have all the pictures about people that need to do work for them, but I think they should be in the loop, because since they are accountable for protecting those resources, we're talking about database, files, applications, right? Again, the level of access must meet the appropriateness of the requirement of the business, and not too much and not too less. So it has to be consistent with also security policy in the company. And we already mentioned about segregation of duty, right? So you don't want to be able to allow a person request an access for themselves and also authorize that access. And one of the things that is very useful and is becoming adopted by many companies is that there need to be written statement for access rights, meaning that the user receiving the access must sign something to acknowledge the kind of access they have, and also acknowledge the kind of responsibility he or she must adhere to. So it's kind of like a contract. This is beyond the work contract, the more generic one. So this is like, if I have access to personal identifiable information and or personal health information, then I have to sign a written agreement that I will not disclose this information to anyone that doesn't have the right to know, not my family member, and not to anyone, even my supervisor, if that person doesn't have the authorization to learn of that information. And also you want to spell out under what circumstances those informations can be shared. So the idea is to be clear to the users what they are obtaining that authorization for and what are the responsibility. Okay? So require the user to sign the statement and indicated they understand the condition of access, making sure the service provider do not provide access until authorization procedure has been completed. So usually if you build this in a workflow, meaning that if the authorization or sign off from manager or the system owner or data owner has not been completed, the workflow will not flow to the system admin to actually create that user account. It won't. So that's to make sure that the system admin person will not create an account even before they were authorized, okay, or sign off by management. Okay, record has to be maintained for any user that are registered for use the service. So using a workflow software like the ticketing system, and so on, Jira or something like that, will have the audit trail. So we know who requested it, when it was requested, who authorized it, who signed off on it, who implement them. Okay, we need accountability in the whole workflow. So we cannot come back and say, oh, I didn't really authorize this person. I had a mistake. So at least someone is being accountable for, right? And then we talked about periodical checking for removal or blocking or any redundant user IDs or accounts. So I talk about something called user access attestation. That's what it is, right? Periodically, the system admin will produce user list, and then it will get the authorizing supervisor to attest that these 10 people under my team that I authorized before should continue to have access. So if that person changed team, it should not be this person authorizing it. It should be the new supervisor authorizing it, right? Again, making sure that there are no redundant IDs, so that you don't issue the same ID to multiple people. I actually had that problem one time that I try to remember what it was, but somehow it happened. Okay, people get I think the name was similar or something like that, so they get created with the same ID, so the other one had a problem, so something like that. So be aware of that.